Imagine you're playing a game with your friends. To the others, it looks like you're losing, but in reality, you're secretly creating the most epic plan to win. In a showdown at the end, you completely destroy your opponent. Afterwards, your friend approaches you and calls you a big brain for planning such an epic winning strategy. You think about it. You do have a large head. But was it actually your larger head, or maybe brain, that made you come up with a better winning strategy? In this video, I want to discuss the question, does a bigger brain make one more intelligent? Let's start with the question itself. What do we mean by brain size? The brain is the central processing unit of our nervous system. And brain size is usually measured in volume or sometimes weight. It is possible to use both, since they are highly correlated. Up to the 1980s, brain size could only be estimated from skull size. This is also the case for everything we know about the evolution of brain size, because, as you can imagine, there are only skeletons left to work with, and we can't measure the actual brains anymore. Of course, it makes sense to assume brain size from head size, but as you can imagine, this technique has some flaws. It's not very precise and, for example, doesn't always account for other things that might lie inside the skull, like cerebrospinal fluid. Today, it is also possible to use modern imaging techniques like MRI to measure the size of the brain in much more detail. You can even measure the size of individual brain regions. The other important part of this question is the intelligence. If I asked you what intelligence is, you probably would intuitively know, but it's quite hard to actually formulate it into a definition. Some things that you could consider part of the definition are problem solving, managing new environments, learning from experiences, reasoning, and more. It's always complicated to work with intelligence because there's not one singular definition for it. Intelligence might have a different definition depending on if you ask a biologist, a psychologist, philosopher, or even someone else. And also, among these people, they might have completely different viewpoints. Of course, if you then try to measure intelligence, the findings won't always be the same. This is already very complicated when we compare humans, so you can imagine how hard it is to compare different animals. Of course, we can compare how complex their behavior is and how intelligent it appears to us, but they all live in different niches of their ecosystem. They have different needs and specializations. Some animals might start to crack nuts with tools like stones because they don't have enough food. But others might not have this problem. They might have very easy access to food and might not even have to start using tools. And yet another animal might not even be able to digest nuts and therefore might not even consider using tools in this way. So the anatomy also plays a role in how animals are able to behave intelligently in their environment. And that doesn't necessarily make them less intelligent. In a nutshell, no pun intended, animals all have a unique spectrum of cognitive abilities that are very hard to compare. Nevertheless, there are a lot of comparisons being done, and also cognitive tests, for example among humans, that try to measure several directions of intelligence and quantify them into numbers. And with all of this said, I don't want to claim that it's impossible to compare intelligence, but we always have to keep in mind that we shouldn't rely too heavily on a single test result. Okay, let's look at the main question again. To find out if a bigger brain makes one more intelligent is very complicated. I specifically mean the causality of this question. Of course, we can try to measure if bigger brains are on average more intelligent, but this doesn't necessarily mean that it really is the bigger overall brain size that is what makes these creatures more intelligent. And I will come back to this point later in the video.
But are animals with bigger brains actually smarter?
The most obvious comparison we could look at is the absolute brain size. So really just the size of the brain without looking at any other factors. To compare the different brains in this slide, we are going to use brain weight as a measurement. If absolute brain weight was directly related to intelligence, sperm whales would be the smartest creatures on Earth. Their brain weighs up to 9 kilograms.
African elephants
would be about 3 times as smart as humans, with a brain of about 4.5 to 5 kilograms. And horses would be smarter than chimpanzees and crows. And from what we know about these animals, that doesn't really make sense. Chimpanzees and crows have proven their intelligence in many experiments. So even though a lot of people claim that there is a correlation between brain weight and intelligence between animals, it is faulty in many cases. So simply having a big brain doesn't necessarily mean that one is intelligent. What is really interesting is that within some groups of animals, it does seem to be a case of the bigger the better. For example, if we just look at humans and compare their brains, bigger brains actually do correlate with a higher cognitive performance. That doesn't mean that you can walk around and directly assume people's intelligence from their brain sizes, but when we look at a big population, bigger brains do seem to be smarter. Looking at all animals, brain size is not that important, but when we compare humans to humans, it suddenly is. How does that make any sense? There are several explanations for it. First of all, bigger brains are usually attached to bigger bodies. If an animal is very big, its brain will also likely be very big, without it suddenly being extremely smart. Here you can see the correlation of body size on the bottom and brain size on the y-axis. All the dots are different animals and the circled green ones are humans. From this, we can compare how big the ratio of body size to brain size is for different animals. This has been used in the past to try to derive intelligence from the anatomy, but it has been proven to be imprecise in many cases. But it's still definitely a factor we have to keep in mind when comparing brain sizes, and it might explain why animals with huge brains, like whales for example, aren't necessarily geniuses. Another thing to remember is brains are different. They're not just all differently sized versions of the same model, but have very big structural differences. The brain of a bird is completely different from that of a mammal, and also between mammals there are big differences. As I said earlier when we looked at intelligence, animals have quite different specializations, and this is reflected in their brains. There's still a lot we don't know about the details of different brains, and especially why they are built this way. But we do know that they are very different. They vary not only in size, but also, for example, in the amount and distribution of neurons and the relative size of brain regions and connectivity. The same thing goes for brains among humans. The differences might not be as big as between different animals, but they are still there. In bigger brains, specific regions are, for example, more scaled up than others. These numbers are very exaggerated, but if person A's brain is half the size of person B's brain, not all brain regions are simply twice as big in person B. One region might be 2.5 times as big, and another might only be 1.5 times as big as in person A. So even if we find that bigger brains in humans are correlated with intelligence, it's not clear if it maybe isn't the overall brain size that leads to this, but rather other factors that just come with overall brain size. Like, for example, the ratio of brain regions. So, looking back at the main question, no, a bigger brain doesn't necessarily make one more intelligent. There is an inconsistent correlation between brain size and intelligence, but there are also a lot of other factors that correlate with intelligence, including the amount and distribution of neurons, size of brain regions, and the connectivity in the brain. And we shouldn't forget that the environment also plays a role in developing intelligence. All animals live in very different environments, they have very different needs, and only the interaction with this environment can lead to intelligent behavior. It's not really just our anatomy that makes us intelligent. It rather gives us the opportunity to experience the world, to learn and become intelligent with a lot of experience during our lifetime. So the next time someone calls you a big brain, you know that it's not just size that matters.